I'm James Ford, and I have. It's such an honor to be an affiliated consulting minister with the First Unitarian Church of Los Angeles, and such an honor to be able to speak once again from this community. A text of sorts, a story adapted from The Hidden Lamp, one of the great contemporary anthologies of Zen stories. The monastery's servant, Chiono, went out on a full moon night to draw some water from the well. The bottom of her old bucket, held together by bamboo strips, suddenly gave way, and the reflection of the moon vanished with the water. When she saw this, Chiono fell into the intimate way. Later, the Zen teacher Joan Sutherland dreamed a commentary. She is at the stream with a lacquer bucket meant for flowers, only she fills it with water. She sees the moon's reflection in the water, her grief radiant. Later still, she says, the bottom falls out of the bucket, water and light soaking into the earth. All that wept, the stream, the watery moon in a bucket, the deer's most moist eyes, the woman weeping. I am obsessed with religions. Actually, I originally wrote this sentence as I am moderately obsessed with religions. But that isn't true. I'm obsessed. Wildly, insanely. Which means my finding a way to make a living as a Unitarian Universalist minister was probably good fortune. Otherwise, I'm only good for some monastic cloister, or more likely, working in a bookstore. Now, with that obsession, I've wandered deeply into definitions and boundaries, and within those bounds to explore how religion, or if you prefer, how spirituality matters. I'll be untwining these terms, religion and spirituality, as we go on. I want to dig into how it all works, not only in the past and deep past, but today, and maybe cast what it can be out into the future. As it turns out, defining religion is a messy project. There are many very good reasons why the word religion can be off-putting, and why in our time and place, for some, spirituality might be a more useful word. It turns out the dictionary definitions of religion aren't very helpful. Mostly, they turn on human relationships with various divinities. And really, since the advent of modern religious studies in the 19th century, and the startling observation, at least to those European and Americans who inaugurated the project, that some very significant number of religions are only secondarily concerned with divinities, makes that definition of religion being about relationships to gods close to worthless. And there's another problem. The phrase spiritual but not religious puts a finger on a major issue with religions. Religions have always been tied up with the transmission of culture, reinforcing the various ways in which people identify themselves, and critically separate themselves from others. That us and then them thing has from ancient times been religiously defined and religiously enforced. One could argue the primary project of religion is simply crowd control. There's a definition. However, there is something beyond culture and crowd control. It is something I find of enormous importance. It is, in fact, the thing to which I have given the bulk of my life. Me, when I think of religions and that cousin word, spirituality, I think of ancient mountain trails used by our Neanderthal cousins as well as our direct ancestors. trails that wind through mountains in ways that seem to include disadvantage to efficiency, but which open enhanced views of vistas, mountains and clouds, and winding streams. That. And there's that cave in Spain with what appears to be a 40,000-year-old grave for a Neanderthal child. The grave site is surrounded by animal horns, including bison and red deer. Similar sites for Homo sapiens with what appear to be intentional burials, including grave goods and evidences of flowers poured over the body that seem to range back at least 50 and maybe even 100,000 years ago. That. Some find the word religion implying a binding back, a folding back, suggesting some kind of return. Religion is most importantly, as I feel it, about wonder and beauty and love. That mysterious human thing we call love, love which even challenges death. Sorting out the crowd control part, spiritual can stand for that part of religion that is about wonder and intimacy. The origin of the word spiritual means breath. Spirituality can be defined as that which gives us life. This said, as far back as we know with any certainty, religion and spirituality and culture have been and are profoundly entangled. In fact, any attempt at pulling specifically spiritual perspectives out of the cultural matrix seems to date no later than during the European Renaissance, and the truth be told, always with only limited success. So, definitions. I've found the 20th century Unitarian Universalist minister and theologian Forrest Church, his observation one of the best. Religion is our human response to the dual reality of being alive and knowing we will die. My own attempt at a definition is that religions are that part of a culture concerned most with meaning and direction. Now, in the face of so many religions, another question presses hard. Is there a thread running through them all, a tie that binds, some universal truth found in all religions? Within religious studies, the technical term for those who say yes is perennialism. Perennialism is the belief that all religions share some particular insight in common. I mentioned that first attempt to define some kind of spiritual thread during the European Renaissance. Marsilio Ficino, a 15th century Italian priest and an early humanist philosopher, observed a common thread running from the Corpus Hermeticum to Greek philosophy and straight through to Christianity. As everyone at the time believed the corpus to have been composed around the time of Moses, it looked pretty obvious. The corpus clearly showed, at the very least, a foreshadowing of Platonism and Christianity, centuries before either happened. The problem was that Ficino got his dates wrong. The corpus was not, as was believed during the Renaissance, written in the 13th century before our common era, when people believed Moses was alive and led the enslaved Jewish people out of Egypt to a promised land. Instead, it was compiled somewhere between the 1st and 3rd centuries of our common era, and is actually a mashup of Platonism and Christianity, not some kind of foreshadowing. For me, this demonstrates both the power of that sense all religions are connected, together with the harsh fact that actual evidence of this is at best tenuous. As one contemporary scholar, Stephen Prothero, titles his provocative book, as we look into the matter, it appears God is not one. The good professor contends the idea of religious unity is wishful thinking. Actually, Prothero goes beyond condemning the unity of religions as fantasy. He asserts it is a willful ignorance that makes the world a more dangerous place. When we act from false premises, after all, folly usually follows. It isn't so much a case of many paths up one mountain, but more likely many paths and many mountains. And yet, there remains something which calls for hedging of definitional bets. Despite the tons of evidence about the differences, there are some threads. There are a couple of places where there are obvious commonalities. For instance, there is the ethical connection among the world's religions. It's hard to have missed one of those lists of the Golden Rule and how that rule is articulated within pretty much all religions. They all believe in equity and treating your neighbor fairly. It may feature more strongly with one tradition than another, but it's always there. In fact, it's probably the deeper connection driving much of today's interfaith dialogue, reminding us of our particular religion's rule to not harm others. The idea is to feel a little closer, to at the very least see each other's humanity, and from that to be a little bit less dangerous to each other. We humans do have a violent edge, and less dangerous is good. I strongly suspect the Golden Rule is rooted in two fundamental aspects of human psychology, which probably has a biological, even an evolutionary basis. We seek harmony, balance, and we see it manifesting in human affairs as fairness. And at the very same time, we have an urge to cheat, to gain an advantage for ourselves and ours. The Golden Rule addresses both these aspects of who we are. But is there something more? Something about ultimacy and meaning and that love which defies death? I find it interesting that Professor Prothero actually noticed one thing that all the world's religions, at least the ones he studied, have in common. He observes what the world's religions share is not so much a finishing line as a starting point. And where they begin is with this simple observation: something is wrong in the world. In part, it is probably tied up with that cheating part of who we are. But it does make many colors, basically as many as there are religions. The good professor goes on to list with what he acknowledges is an oversimplistic schema of how religions see that wrong and their differing solutions. For Judaism, the problem is exile, while the solution is returning home. For Christians, the problem is sin, and the solution is salvation. For Islam, the problem is pride, and the solution, submission. The list goes on. For each, there is a fundamental noticing of some sort of problem in life, a lack, a wound, something missing. And out of this sense of wrong, of lack, of lostness, of aloneness, of wound, sometimes something happens. Some eruption of heart and mind. An example from my life. I often tell this story because it is so important to me. If you've heard it before or read it in one of my books, I apologize. But it also fits in here in this reflection in an important way. In my teenage years, I discovered the 19th century Hindu saint Ramakrishna, mainly through the writings of Aldous Huxley and Christopher Isherwood, both of whom I adored. They were deeply tangled up with a Hindu mission, the Vedanta Society. Isherwood in particular wrote a lot on the subject. In one of his books, I read an account about how Ramakrishna prayed constantly for a vision of his goddess, in his case Kali, the Divine Mother. He wanted to know her as she was. He wanted to see her with his own eyes, to be present to her with his whole being. And one day she came to him. In some form of waking vision as he watched, she arose out of a river, walked toward him. As she walked, the goddess swelled out in pregnancy, gave birth, and then ate the child. Witnessing all this, Ramakrishna slipped into a fever of ecstasy. As a teenager, I was shocked that this would be a turning point in the revered saint's life. And I had no idea what to make of Kali. It all seemed so awful. As my life moved on, I filed the story away somewhere in the recesses of my heart, never completely forgetting it. Years later, after I'd left the Buddhist monastery where I'd been living, I went to rural Oregon to visit my brother. While there, I took a walk where I found myself at the edge of a genuine wilderness. It was wonderful, if also a bit eerie to a convinced city boy like myself. I sat in the shade of a large flat rock beside a creek. All these years later, I can still taste the air from that day. I can smell the warmth and the vegetation, the way the light played across everything. At the very same time, the place was deeply silent and abuzz with life. Then, in the midst of it all, I noticed there was a sunny spot on a good-sized rock in the middle of the creek. I watched as a large, fat toad hopped up, settled down, and sunned itself. All was right with the universe. What I didn't notice, until just as it struck, was the snake. My heart leapt into my throat. I was frozen to the spot as I witnessed it all happen. In a bloody moment, snake and frog fell behind the rock and out of sight. A small mitzvah. Then, minutes later, the snake slithered up onto the rock in the same place with a large swelling in its middle, and lazed in that same sunny spot. Instantly, I recalled Kali and Ramakrishna and that horrific vision triggering his joy. And now, somehow for me, it was mine, personally, viscerally, in a moment where I surrendered analysis and just witnessed everything. Sorrow, absolutely sorrow, but with it joy, calmness and ecstasy. Every feeling played across my heart. It seemed a moment that held the entire cosmos, excluding nothing. I felt my being grabbed like that snake grabbed the frog. And I realized while sitting there in the shade witnessing it all that I too was swallowed by the world itself. And I realized in some deep, intimate way I was the world itself. I met Kali, and she was me. No part of the great mess, frog, snake, the world, hurt or joy, was alien to me. It was me. The word I found for this was love. Insane, wild, consuming love. And this is important. It was a complete disruption in my life. In one moment, there was a world I'd carefully come to understand. And then the next, it was gone. And a new world was taking shape. In many ways, it resembled the older one, but fundamentally, it was different. And this is so important, I believe this possibility of new eyes is as common as our humanity. Among my favorite Zen teachings is the story of the Buddhist nun Chiono. One day, long before she became a famous Zen master, when she wasn't even a nun, but rather a servant at a convent, while carrying a bucket filled with water, noticed the moon reflecting in the water in the bucket. Then, suddenly, the bottom of the bucket gave way. And as the water and the moon vanished, she awakened into the intimate way. Later, commenting on Shiono's moment, the Zen teacher Joan Sutherland sings into our hearts a dream of this moment. She is at the stream with a lacquer bucket meant for flowers, only she fills it with water. She sees the moon's reflection in the water, her grief radiant. Later still, she says, the bottom falls out of the bucket, water and light soaking into the earth. All that wet, the stream, the watery moon in a bucket, the deer's moist eyes, the woman weeping. The only word I can give this is love. It is the secret of the spiritual within religions. Sometimes these disruptions are grand, the snakes and frogs and the goddess Kali. Often they're much more subtle. But one way or another, they're always the bottom dropping out of our bucket. The disruptions we experience open gates for us. If we don't close the gates too quickly, but try to remain open, there are things we can find. And this does appear in all religions. The religions each express this differently, but somewhere each offers a way to encounter the intimate. Maybe it's a bit less perennialism with some secret teaching, and more universalism, a noticing all of us are born to find the great harmony, the healing of our broken hearts, finding how we are water and light soaking into the good earth. You know, love. Now, with that water and light, it turns out something dangerous appears. This unitive experience tells us how intimately connected we all are, and often it leads people to act on behalf of others. That golden rule. When this leads to charity, all is pretty good. As the late Bishop Dom Helder Camara noted, when I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. One expression of intimacy, absolutely, as wonderful can be. Bread is God. Rice is God. But it sometimes leads a step further. When people like the good bishop then ask why people are poor, well then, shit may hit the fan. That question, after all, violates a cardinal aspect of normative organized religion, supporting the status quo. That crowd control thing. This is why the spiritual is not always appreciated within religion or culture. With this particular expression of intimacy, one that comes with challenges to the way things are, the heart of the intimate encounter, people become dangerous. The mystics, and we are talking about the heart of the mystic project, those captured by the spirit, the breath, the noticing of our connections, are always at the edge of their traditions. Always. And their teachings are often suppressed. And sometimes, if they're too noisy, they may be dealt with. Often harshly. What common threads to the world's religions? Want common threads to the world's religions? Well, this is one. Suppress the voices of the intimate way. And yet, in every culture, among every religion, disruptions of the heart happen. People discover the intimate, and out of that find new lives. This unitive experience begins as a new way of seeing. It is the heart that sees the story of Ramakrishna and Kali as one's own, of that frog and snake as one's own. It is what is found when the bucket shatters and the water and light sink into the good earth. the intimate way, the many paths of love. I'm pretty sure that this is in fact the common ground of all religions. What we do with it, well, that's in your hands. The hands that give bread. The hands that bend that fabled arc toward justice.